other important contributions to the new perspective on Paul came from the scholar N.T. Wright. And Professor Yinger says this about him: one of the characteristics of his position is how he sets Paul's theology within the larger biblical story or narrative of God's work with Israel. And also this video, part 4 of the new perspective of Paul, is based on Professor Yinger's book, The New Perspective on Paul, an Introduction. So, according to this, Paul's letter should be understood with this context in mind. God's intention for humanity and creation was temporarily derailed through Adam's sin. That's in Genesis 1 to 11. The resolution of this dilemma was the family of Abraham, or Israel, through whom the divine blessing was to extend to all humanity. That's Genesis 12. However, Jewish people failed as well to fulfill their role as the instrument of God's blessing to the world. Instead of being the light for the nations, they wandered from their covenant obligations, ultimately into exile. It would thus be left up to Israel's representative to fulfill Adam's originally intended role under God. Messiah Jesus is Israel, the seed of Abraham, the Son of God, and his obedience, death, and resurrection are Israel's obedience, death, and resurrection. He is the climax of God's covenantal dealings with Israel and humanity, or Adam. Notice, for Wright, the story is less about sinful individuals being rescued from judgment for guilt, although it is for him also about that, and more about God's fulfillment of his purposes for all creation through Israel. So, how does this relate to the topic of rescue or salvation? Israel's failure was not legalism or works righteousness, but national righteousness. The belief that fleshly Jewish descendants guarantees membership of God's true covenant people. Elsewhere, Wright terms this as charter of national privilege. Rather than fulfilling her vocation as a light to the nations, Israel viewed herself in exclusive possession of God's blessings. And only those who became a member of Israel, signified for males by circumcision, could have access to these same blessings. This corresponds to Dunn's take on works of law. However, as John the Baptist had already stated to the nation, and now he cites Matthew 3, 9-10, and I cite the NRSV, do not presume to say to yourself, we have Abraham as our ancestor. For I tell you, God is able from these stones to raise up children to Abraham. Even now the axe is lying at the root of the trees. Every tree, therefore, that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. So we have thus outlined the essential parts of the new view of Paul, at least as far as the mainstream of the scholars is concerned. The scholars writing about the new view on Paul, the new perspective on Paul. And we can summarize it in 4 topics. The first is, first century Judaisms were not legalistic, but were characterized by covenantal nomism, saved by God's grace and obligated to follow his ways. Second, since Jews were not espousing works righteousness, Paul was not opposing legalism in his letters. Third, instead, at issue was a question of social identity. Who belongs to the people of God and how is this known? Does one have to be Jewish, be circumcised, keep food laws, celebrate Sabbath, etc., in order to inherit the promises to Abraham? And fourth, Paul does not differ from most other Jews as to the roles of grace, faith, and works in salvation. Where he differs is the conviction that Jesus is Israel's Messiah and the Lord of all creation. No longer is Torah the defining center of God's dealings. What counts now is belonging to Christ. And various scholars have also dealt intensely with certain formulations and frequently used terms. For example, Don Garlington, for instance, has explored the importance of Paul's phrase, the obedience of faith, as in Romans 1:5 or 16:26. His work highlights the eschatological or already or not yet nature of justification. Believers are already justified by grace through faith in Christ. Yet, they still await final justification or vindication, deliverance from the final wrath. This makes sense according to Garlington once we see that all of Christ's benefits are available only in Christ, that is, via union with Christ. And thus, for Paul, it is necessary not only to begin the journey of faith in Christ, but equally to preserve in the obedience of faith to the end, that is, to remain in Christ. And then he writes, my own, so Professor Yinger's work, also falls clearly within the NPP camp, so the New Perspective on Paul camp. In particular, Paul, Judaism and Judgment According to Deeds, his book, attempts to demonstrate that Paul did not break with his Jewish convictions regarding the role of works or obedience in final salvation. His insistence that Christ believers would be judged according to their deeds for salvation reiterates both the language and the concepts he had earlier learned. And then as an example, he cites 2 Corinthians 5:10, and this is an RSV. For all of us must appear before the judgment seat of Christ, so that each may receive recompense for what has been done in the body, whether good or evil. And it's interesting that other translation translated here not what has been done, but works. They use the word works, and especially in German translation we see that it's the works which are important. There are several other scholars with additional, further, or sometimes divergent interpretations, which I will not go into here for the sake of time. As a scholar, is it best to be somewhat cautious with one's assertions and limit oneself to what one can prove with certainty. However, since it's also to a large extent about interpretation of Paul's text, I would like to conclude this section with a somewhat pointed formulation. And this is: anyone who believes that faith in Christ alone is necessary for salvation, and I explain the footnote in a second. So everyone who believes that faith in Christ alone is necessary for salvation in order to receive this grace, and that one's own works are completely unimportant, is not following Christ or Paul, but Martin Luther and traditional Protestantism. Okay, this is a somewhat pointed formulation, and as a footnote I said, okay, salvation means I leave out theological topics like justification, sanctification, synergism, etc. But it's worth to think about again. If we think it's faith in Christ alone and works, our works, are unimportant, is this really what we see in the texts? Is this really what Paul wrote and what he wanted to that we understand it that way? But what about this text or this verse or this passage in Paul's writings and his letters? I can already hear that. And it's good if you know that and you think, oh, that doesn't seem to fit with the new perspective on Paul. That's exactly what other people also did, other scholars. And we will come to that in the next part of this series, in part number 5. Thank you very much for watching and goodbye.